She was a most wanted woman in Nazi-occupied France. Not because she was violent, though she could be. Not because she was loud, though she made herself heard. But because no matter how hard they searched, no matter how many spies they deployed, they couldn't catch her. She moved through their streets like smoke through a keyhole. Silent, elusive, deadly. They called her the White Mouse. And the name alone became a symbol of fear inside Gestapo offices. But before she became a ghost of the enemy, she was flesh and blood. Just a girl from New Zealand. A nurse. A reporter. A woman with a laugh loud enough to fill a room. And eventually, the courage to tear down a regime. To understand how Nancy Wake became one of the most effective spies of the Second World War, we need to start far away from the battlefield. In 1912, she was born in Wellington, New Zealand, the youngest of 6. Her father left the family when she was still a child, vanishing back to Australia and leaving her mother to raise them alone. It wasn't just abandonment. It was betrayal. And for a girl with nothing, that betrayal sharpened her edges. By the time she was 16, she was gone, on a boat to America, then later to London, chasing independence with a fire that never quite cooled. In her early 20s, she found herself in Paris. Not just in Paris, but in love with it. She worked as a journalist, and it was through her assignments that she first saw the face of fascism. While visiting Vienna in the 1930s, she witnessed Nazi soldiers beating Jewish men in the streets, dragging them from their homes. And something inside her snapped, not just because of the violence, but because of the passivity of the crowd. People watched. No one moved. It wasn't just injustice. It was apathy. And Nancy Wake would never be apathetic. She eventually married a wealthy French industrialist, Henri Fiacre. They lived a life of luxury in Marseille. But the world was changing. War was coming. And as France collapsed under German invasion in 1940, Nancy made a decision. She would not run. She would resist. She joined the escape lines, networks of underground operatives who smuggled Allied soldiers out of occupied France. It started small. Forged documents. Secret drop points. Hiding men in cellars. But Nancy didn't do anything small for long. She became a crucial part of the Pat O'Leary line, one of the most effective escape networks in France. She escorted down pilots across hundreds of miles, sometimes through forests, sometimes over the Pyrenees, dodging German patrols, relying on nothing more than her wits and a hard-won ability to charm or bluff her way through anything. She learned to change her accent, dye her hair, forge papers. She could be anyone, speak any language, fade into any background. The Nazis knew someone was helping Allied soldiers escape. They just didn't know who. And every time they thought they were close, she slipped away. Hence the nickname, the White Mouse. But evading capture wasn't just about cleverness. It was about nerve, because the moment she was caught, she wouldn't be interrogated. She'd be tortured. And she knew that. Every mission she took on, every pilot she guided, every train she boarded under a false name, she was rolling the dice. And each time she won, until it became too dangerous to stay. The Gestapo had put her face on wanted posters. She was at the top of their list. Her life in France was over. She fled to Britain, where her real transformation began. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was recruiting agents to parachute behind enemy lines. They needed people who could sabotage railways, cut communications, lead resistance cells. They needed someone with grit, with fluency in French, with combat instincts and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught. Nancy didn't just qualify. She stood out. During training, instructors said she was a natural leader. She learned to kill with her bare hands, learned to code messages, use explosives, fire a weapon with precision. One report from the Times said she was a real man's woman, but they were wrong. She wasn't a man's anything. She was a problem for the enemy. And soon, she'd be their worst nightmare. That's where we leave her, for now, not as a legend, not yet, but on the edge of becoming one. She would return to France, this time not to smuggle pilots, but command an entire resistance army. She would derail trains, blow up bridges, kill Nazis with a knife in the dark, and then vanish before dawn. But that's in the next chapter. What made Nancy Wake so dangerous wasn't that she could fight. It was that she believed the fight was necessary. She didn't start with hatred for the enemy. She started with love. Love for her country. Love for freedom. Love for the people she helped. And when the world cracked open, she didn't flinch. She stepped through it. Quiet, sharp, relentless, just like a mouse. The skies over France were black that night, moonless, starless, and cold. Somewhere in the dark, a figure dropped silently through the air, parachute snapping open above her. It was April 1944, just months before D-Day. And the woman falling through the darkness wasn't a soldier in uniform. She didn't have rank, but she carried something heavier than any medal: purpose. Her name was Nancy Wake, and what she was about to do would ignite chaos behind German lines. Her landing wasn't graceful. She hit the ground hard, tangled in branches, skirt hiked up to her waist, legs scraped. As she stood up and brushed herself off, the French resistance fighters who'd come to meet her stared. One of them finally muttered, "I hope all the women we're sent are as pretty as you." Nancy smirked, shrugged off the comment, and got to work. She hadn't fallen into France to flirt. She'd come to blow things up. Her mission with the SOE was clear: organize and train local resistance groups known as the Maquis, coordinate sabotage operations against the Nazis, and prepare the countryside for the Allied invasion. She was dropped into the Auvergne region, deep in central France, where forests and mountains offered shelter but also danger. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere. Every farmer could be a collaborator. Every informant could doom an entire network. But none of that rattled her. Nancy knew fear was part of the job. What mattered was how you carried it. Her first order of business was making contact with the resistance leaders and earning their respect. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were farmers, factory workers, students, ex-prisoners, men who had picked up weapons because they had no other choice. Many of them didn't trust outsiders, let alone a woman from New Zealand dropped in by the British. But Nancy didn't try to impress them with bravado. She showed them what she could do. Within weeks, she was organizing weapons drops from Allied planes, coordinating attacks on German convoys, and teaching resistance fighters how to handle explosives. She memorized maps of the region, planned ambushes with military precision, and moved constantly to avoid detection. Her energy was endless. She barely slept. She often cycled dozens of miles across rough terrain to deliver messages or scout locations. And when food ran low, she rationed her own portions to feed others. In a world ruled by fear, Nancy gave people something to believe in. And then came her first major operation, a coordinated sabotage of the German supply lines, feeding their troops in Normandy. Bridges were blown. Train tracks were torn up. Communications were cut. Explosives planted on railway lines sent locomotives screeching off tracks into forests. These weren't just disruptions. These were tactical strikes that crippled German mobility and communication. And Nancy was in the middle of all of it, calm, focused, ruthless. But war doesn't give you victories without consequences. The German response was swift and brutal. They rounded up civilians, tortured suspected resistance members, and executed prisoners in public. Every time Nancy struck a blow, she knew there would be retaliation. But she also knew that hesitation cost more lives. Her philosophy was simple: hit hard, hit fast, vanish, and never, ever get caught. The Gestapo came close. Too close. In one infamous moment, Nancy had to cycle over 300 kilometers, more than 180 miles, in just over 72 hours to replace lost radio equipment and reconnect with London. She rode through Nazi checkpoints, freezing nights, and enemy patrol forests. No sleep, no backup, just her and the road. When she returned, exhausted and covered in grime, her fellow fighters stared in disbelief. One of them whispered, "She rides like the devil himself is chasing her." But it wasn't the devil. It was duty. Her growing legend inspired her comrades and infuriated the Nazis. They still didn't know her name, but they knew her work. Bridges kept exploding. Munitions depots caught fire in the dead of night. German trucks disappeared on roads that had been quiet the day before. Their intelligence reports were filled with references to a woman. Tall, dark-haired, foreign accent, unstoppable. The white mouse had returned, and this time she wasn't running. Command wasn't just something Nancy assumed. It was something others gave her. The Maquis fighters began to follow her orders without question. She had a natural authority, firm but fair, tough without cruelty. She made people feel that what they were doing mattered, that they weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. And every skirmish, every ambush, every act of defiance was a declaration that they would not be broken. By summer 1944, Nancy and her resistance network had become one of the most feared guerrilla forces in occupied France. In one skirmish near Montlucan, her fighters killed over 1,400 German soldiers while losing just a few dozen men. The scale of the attack stunned the enemy. Nancy had orchestrated it all. She wasn't just a spy anymore. She was a commander of a shadow army. She once said that she hated killing, but she would do it again and again if it meant stopping fascism. It wasn't about glory. It was about conviction. And when she had made the call to execute a traitor in their ranks, someone who had endangered their entire network, she didn't flinch. The war left no room for softness, only survival. But Nancy Wake's story isn't just about heroism in combat. It's about the resilience of someone who refused to be underestimated, who rejected every box the world tried to put her in. Spy, yes, but also strategist, leader, rebel. She did the work of 10 men and asked for no recognition. Her only regret was that she couldn't do more. And through it all, she carried a secret weight. Her husband, Henri, had been captured and executed by the Gestapo after she fled France the first time. He had refused to give up her location. He was tortured, then shot. Nancy didn't learn the full truth until after the war. She never remarried. Some wounds go too deep for time to touch. But that grief didn't slow her down. If anything, it fueled her. She once said, "I kill a lot of Germans, and I'm only sorry I didn't kill more." She wasn't being callous. She was being honest. War had taken everything from her, and in return, she gave it hell. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, Nancy Wake had done more damage behind German lines than entire battalions. She wasn't just a cog in the war machine. She was a wrench in its gears. And still, this was only the middle of her story. What happened after the invasion, how her network expanded, how she survived betrayal, and how she walked away from the war not as a victim, but as a storm that passed through. Those are the next pieces of the puzzle. She didn't just fight for her country. She fought for every person who believed that evil should never go unchallenged. And she proved, time and time again, that courage isn't about size or strength. It's about will. The summer of 1944 didn't feel like summer in the forests of central France. There were no lazy afternoons, no laughter over shared wine, no safety in silence. The air crackled with tension. German trucks rumbled down narrow roads. Fighter planes circled overhead. The war was tightening like a fist, and Nancy Wake was squeezing back just as hard. By now, she was no longer just coordinating sabotage. She was commanding hundreds of resistance fighters. The Maquis had grown into a formidable force, and with the Allied invasion of Normandy finally underway, the stakes were higher than ever. Their job was to create chaos, to hit the Germans so hard and so often behind the lines that they couldn't reinforce the front. Every delay, every destroyed supply line, every derailed train meant fewer men and weapons reaching the beaches where Allied soldiers bled for every inch. And Nancy? She was in the thick of it, not in some headquarters sending orders over the radio. She was in the fields, the forests, the battle lines. At one point, she led a raid on a German garrison. Charging through gunfire with grenades clipped to her belt, a submachine gun slung across her shoulder. The attack was brutal. Bullets tore through trees. Explosions shook the ground. But when the smoke cleared, the Germans were retreating, and Nancy was still standing. But victories didn't come clean. The deeper the resistance pushed, the darker the war became. Betrayal was always a breath away. Informants sold secrets for favors or out of fear. Friends vanished in the night, arrested, tortured, executed. And each time it happened, Nancy had to make a choice. Mourn or move. She always moved. In one chilling incident, the Maquis captured a suspected traitor. someone who had given names to the Gestapo. There was no trial, no court, just evidence. Nancy listened, reviewed the details, and made the call. The man was taken to a field, and she pulled the trigger herself. Years later, she was asked about it. She didn't dodge. She didn't excuse. She said, "It was my responsibility. I couldn't let someone else do it. If I asked men to die for me, I had to be willing to do the same." That's who she was. A commander who didn't just lead from the front. She bore the weight of her choices alone. The Germans were furious. The White Mouse was no longer just a phantom. She was a symbol of rebellion. They doubled the reward for her capture, posted her description in every town. But they never caught her. She kept moving, changing identities, changing routes. She slept in barns, in caves, under the stars. Ate whatever she could scavenge. Carried messages stitched into the lining of her coat. And through it all, she laughed. That same sharp, cutting laugh she'd carried since Paris. It unnerved people. It was a sound of defiance, of not being broken. By late summer, the Maquis under Nancy's leadership had blown up supply trains, ambushed convoys, and destroyed communications across an entire region. They were more than a nuisance. They were a nightmare. German command reports referred to heavy losses inflicted by female-led partisans. It wasn't just the casualties. It was the humiliation. A woman, foreign, fearless, uncatchable, was making fools of them. And the more damage she did, the more stories spread. Some said she could speak 6 languages and switch accents mid-sentence. Others claimed she could kill a man with her bare hands. That she once strangled a sentry with her own shoelace. That she laughed while doing it. The truth? Some of it was exaggerated, but most of it wasn't. Nancy didn't care about the myths. She cared about results. And results were what she delivered. But even heroes bleed, and the war, as always, demanded its price. During an assault on a German weapons depot, one of her closest comrades was shot beside her. He died in her arms, gasping for breath. Nancy didn't cry. She held his hand until he was gone. Then she got up, grabbed his rifle, and finished the job. Later that night, sitting by a fire with her men, she didn't speak. She just stared into the flames. War carved silence into you. And for all her fire, even Nancy had nights with a weight pressed down. Still, she never stopped. There were always more missions, more explosives to plant, more bridges to collapse. One of her most daring raids came when she led a nighttime attack on a German checkpoint. She wore all black, face painted, knife strapped to her leg. The plan was simple. Get in, kill the guards, destroy the radio tower. What followed was a whirlwind of chaos. Close quarters fighting, flames licking the sky, sirens wailing into the trees. When it was over, the tower was ash. And once again, Nancy walked away. She was wounded more than once. Took shrapnel in her leg, bruised ribs, a cracked wrist. But she refused to be evacuated. She said, "I'll die here before I run again." And she meant it. By September, the Allied forces had pushed deep into France. Town after town was being liberated. And as soldiers marched in, they found resistance fighters already there, armed, organized, victorious. At their head, more often than not, was a tall, dark-haired woman with a gun in one hand and a cigarette in the other. They didn't know who she was, but they knew what she'd done. Eventually, the war began to turn. The Germans were retreating, their control collapsing. And Nancy Wake had played no small part in that unraveling. She didn't win battles. She waged a war of 1,000 cuts, and each cut drained the enemy. But as the guns quieted and the flags changed, Nancy didn't celebrate. She didn't march in parades. Her war hadn't been about glory. It had been about vengeance, justice, purpose. And when the fight was over, what remained wasn't peace. It was aftermath, loss, ghosts, the cost of doing what needed to be done. She had survived where many didn't. But survival isn't always relief. Sometimes it's a burden. And the question that lingered in her mind was it worth it? It was, could I have done more? The answer, like the woman herself, was never simple. The guns didn't go silent all at once. They tapered off, fading like thunder drifting over the horizon. And for the first time in years, the forests of France weren't full of fear. They were full of echoes of what had happened and what couldn't be undone. The war was ending. But for Nancy Wake, there was no victory march, no champagne, just silence and the weight of everything she carried. The German lines collapsed under Allied pressure. City by city, France was being freed, but liberation didn't bring joy so much as breathless exhaustion. People emerged from basements, from ruins, from the shadows where they'd survived. Streets that once echoed with jackboots now rang with cheers. Flags returned to windows. Names of the dead were painted on walls. And through it all, in the villages and towns of the Auvergne, stories spread like wildfire about a woman who had blown up bridges and outwitted Nazis, who had trained farmers to become soldiers, who had led ambushes and escaped every trap. She became a legend, not just to the resistance, but to the people she'd helped save. And then came the visitors, British officers, French commanders, Americans with cameras and notebooks. They all wanted to meet her, to pin medals to her chest, to ask how she'd done it. But Nancy wasn't interested in being a symbol. She hadn't fought to be remembered. She'd fought because there was no other choice. When they asked what she wanted for her service, she said nothing, except for Henri. But Henri was gone. It took months for the full truth to reach her. After she fled France in 1943, the Gestapo had arrested her husband, Henri Fiacca. They knew he had helped her. They tortured him for information. He gave them nothing, not a single word. For that silence, they executed him, shot him without trial, buried him in an unmarked grave. Nancy had suspected. But confirmation is a different kind of wound. It doesn't bleed. It sinks. She never remarried, said she didn't see the point. Some part of her had stayed in that basement in Marseille where they'd last said goodbye, but the world moved on, and it demanded she do the same. The war ended in 1945. Europe was a wreckage of buildings, bodies, and broken nations. Nancy returned to London, then to Paris. She was awarded the George Medal by Britain, the Medal of Freedom by the United States, and multiple honors from France, including Croix de Guerre not once, but 3 times. She was even made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. Most people would have worn those medals with pride. Nancy put them in a drawer. She once joked, "I've always hated the idea of medals. You get them, and they just remind you of the people who didn't." Still, the press followed her. Stories ran in papers across the globe. They called her a heroine, a spy, a warrior. Some romanticized her as a femme fatale. Others saw her as a national treasure. But very few understood what it cost to become all those things. She tried returning to civilian life, but it never quite fit. She went back to journalism briefly, then into politics. She stood for Parliament in Australia, twice, but lost both times. Some said she was too blunt, too sharp-tongued, too unwilling to play the game. She didn't care. She wasn't interested in approval. She'd already lived through a world where silence was deadly. She had no interest in keeping her opinions quiet. In the years that followed, she drifted. London, Paris, Sydney. She worked intelligence jobs, gave occasional interview, but mostly kept to herself. The world had moved into a new era. Post-war prosperity, consumer culture, television, nuclear fears. But Nancy Wake was from a different world. A world of shadows, of sabotage, of moral clarity, where people risked everything not for recognition, but because they believed it was right. And still, people tried to define her. They called her fearless. But that wasn't quite right. Nancy had felt fear, plenty of it. What made her remarkable wasn't its absence. It was her ability to move through it anyway, to act, even when the odds were impossible. As she aged, the world slowly began to catch up to her story. Documentaries were made, books were written, and yet she remained unimpressed by attention. She once said, "In war, you don't think about bravery. You think about how to survive long enough to get the job done." That was her code. Not glory, not fame, just getting the job done. But even the fiercest fighters eventually have to slow down. In her later years, Nancy lived modestly. She didn't have children. Her friends dwindled with time. Yet her wit remained razor-sharp. When asked how she wanted to be remembered, she quipped, "As someone who did her bit." Just that. Not a savior. Not a legend. Just someone who did her bit. But history won't let it rest there. Because Nancy Wake wasn't just a woman who helped in the war. She was the war in the quiet moments behind enemy lines, in the footsteps that disappeared before dawn, in the explosions no one saw coming. She was the fire that refused to be extinguished. And she remains proof, living, breathing, laughing proof, that one person can make 1,000 cracks in the walls of tyranny. That even in the darkest of times, there are people who will stand up, speak out, and fight back. Not because they want to, but because they must. The war ended, but Nancy Wake never really came home. Not in the way people imagine. She returned to cities she knew, wore dresses again, spoke into microphones, smiled for photos. But something had shifted deep inside her, a quiet distance that never quite closed. When you've lived on the edge for so long, normal life doesn't feel real. It feels artificial. She spent the late 1940s between London and Paris. The Allies celebrated her, nations awarded her medals, but none of it brought comfort. She walked streets where memories clung to walls. Cafes where she once passed secret messages were now crowded with tourists. Train stations that had been death traps were just mundane. France had moved on, and she couldn't blame it, but she couldn't join it either. She returned to Australia, thinking perhaps that was the answer, that the place of her childhood might offer some kind of peace. But Australia hadn't waited for her. It barely remembered her. In fact, when she applied for veterans' benefits, she was told she didn't qualify. Her service had been through the British and French, not the Australian military. Paperwork, technicalities, bureaucracy that didn't care what you'd survived, only which uniform you wore. She was furious, not for herself, but for what it said about how easily heroism could be forgotten. Still, she tried. She bought a house in Sydney. She reconnected with family. She cooked. She read. She even ran for office under the Liberal Party banner. Twice. But politics in peacetime was a different battlefield. Instead of principles and missions, it was parties and power. She wasn't interested in winning by compromise. She wanted to speak plainly, and people weren't used to that anymore. Or maybe they never had been. One journalist described her campaign speeches as too direct. Another said she was abrasive, but she didn't apologize. She never had. She simply said, "I didn't fight Nazis for 5 years to come back and bite my tongue now." Through the 50s and 60s, her life was quiet. She lived alone, occasionally traveling, often retreating. She had friends, yes, but not many who truly understood. It's hard to explain to someone what it means to trust a man with your life one day and bury him the next. Harder still to explain how that becomes normal, and even harder to admit that part of you misses it. She returned to France often, visiting the places where she'd fought, laying flowers on the graves of fallen comrades. The resistance fighters, the couriers, the radio operators, the locals who risked everything. Some she'd lost in gunfights, others to torture. A few had simply vanished. She never forgot any of them, and she never stopped mourning Henri. Decades passed, and yet she still wore a gold bracelet he had given her. Even in her 90s, when her memory began to drift, she would sometimes speak to him, quietly, as if he were still in the room. That kind of love doesn't fade. It becomes part of your spine. Silent, constant. In 1985, the French government tried to honor her again. They held a ceremony full of fanfare and speeches. Nancy was polite. She accepted the award. But when asked how she felt, she said, "They could have shot me during the war, and now they want to thank me. It's a bit late for flowers." Still, despite her bluntness, France adored her. She was a living legend. Tour guides spoke her name with reverence. Veterans saluted her in the streets. Young women clutched her hand, asking for stories. And while she resisted romanticizing the past, she did offer advice. Once, A journalist asked her what she thought the key to courage was. She laughed and said, "A bottle of good scotch and a damn good reason." But courage, as she knew, wasn't just in the doing. It was in the living afterward. The quiet years, the moments without missions, without purpose. Nancy never called herself brave. She said she was practical. She saw something wrong and she fixed it. That was her lens. Simple, clear, but the world kept pulling her back into the spotlight. Biographers came knocking. Filmmakers, too. Some wanted to tell her story. Others wanted to own it. And she was wary of all of them, especially when they tried to shape her into something she wasn't. A symbol, a stereotype, a slogan. She once told a reporter, "Don't you dare make me a martyr. I didn't fight for pity. I fought because it had to be done." And so she lived quietly. Her later years were spent in London, in a modest apartment near the Thames. No fanfare, no staff, just an aging woman who had once brought an empire to its knees. She didn't complain. She had outlived dictators, survived wars, and buried the love of her life. What was there to fear now? When asked if she had any regrets, she paused only once. That I didn't do more. That I didn't kill more Nazis. It was a jarring thing to hear. But to Nancy, it wasn't about bloodlust. It was about justice. Every German she'd killed had been part of a machine that murdered innocents. Every mission had been a blow against cruelty. She didn't kill out of hatred. She killed to protect. That distinction mattered to her, even if the world didn't always understand. And yet, she was not without humor. Even in old age, she joked, flirted, and cursed like a soldier. She had a drink every night, usually gin, sometimes scotch. She said it kept her honest. Her friends said it kept her young. In her final years, she moved into a veteran's home, not out of need, but choice. She liked being around others who understood. Soldiers, nurses, people with stories too big for polite conversation. She told hers only when asked. And when she did, she didn't dramatize. She just told it straight. No embellishment, no self-pity. Just facts, memories, and the occasional swear word. Because for all the titles history gave her, spy, hero, warrior, she remained, to the very end, a woman who did her bit. And that was enough. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of a story. It turns people into symbols, reduces struggle to slogans, and smooths over the cracks with nostalgia. But Nancy Wake refused to be softened. She knew exactly what she'd done, what it had cost, and she didn't want her story polished into something more palatable. War, she once said, is not a Hollywood movie. It's blood and guts and rotten food and fear, and doing things you never thought you could. And yet, as she aged, people kept trying to frame her differently, as a romantic figure, as a patriotic poster child, as a lady spy with a touch of glamour. They wanted a character, not a person. But Nancy had never been interested in playing a part. She didn't fit into the boxes people built for women of her time, certainly not the ones they tried to put her in after. She wasn't soft-spoken. She didn't wear pearls and pose beside tanks. She swore. She drank. She laughed at her own legend. Once, during a radio interview, someone asked if she considered herself a feminist. She responded with a snort, "I killed Nazis. Does that count?" But she wasn't being dismissive. She was making a point. Nancy Wake didn't fight for ideology. She fought for people, for the right to live freely, to love, to choose. And when systems threatened that, when governments fell, when fascism rose, she didn't wait for permission to act. She just acted. That's what made her dangerous. That's what made her powerful. Not just to the Nazis, but to any narrative that tried to tame her. In the years following the war, as memories faded and the world shifted its focus to new conflicts, Nancy's name quietly slipped from public consciousness. There were no statues, no history books in classrooms telling her story. In Australia, where she'd grown up, she was barely mentioned. In Britain, overshadowed by larger-than-life figures with uniforms and rank. Even in France, where she'd done the most damage to the enemy, recognition came slowly, decades too late. But the resistance never forgot her. Among surviving Maquis fighters, she remained a legend. They told stories around tables, in dusty cafes. Stories of the woman who could outshoot any man in the group, the woman who could cycle hundreds of kilometers without sleep, the one who made them believe they could win, even when the odds were impossible. To them, she wasn't just a commander. She was the heart of the resistance. And slowly, the world began to remember. In the early 2000s, as a new generation started rediscovering the forgotten heroes of the 20th century, Nancy's name resurfaced. Documentaries were made, articles published. Young historians found her name in footnotes and chased the story behind the myth. What they found wasn't just a hero. It was a challenge to everything they'd been taught about who gets remembered and why. They found a woman who didn't ask for credit, who never sought applause, who led missions that shifted the course of battles, and never asked for a single line in a textbook. And they asked, why was she forgotten? The answer isn't simple. It never is. Maybe because she didn't fit the narrative people wanted. Maybe because she wasn't a man in uniform. Maybe because she didn't care about being likable, only about being useful. Or maybe because history so often forgets those who make the biggest noise without asking for the spotlight. But as the world began to recognize what had been missed, something changed. Streets in France were named after her. Schools carried her story into their curriculum. In Australia, belated recognition finally came. She was offered a state funeral. She accepted on one condition: no fuss. Because even in death, Nancy Wake didn't want to be turned into a statue. She wanted people to remember what she did, not to worship it, but to understand it, to understand that courage doesn't always come with ceremony. Sometimes it comes with grit, with stubbornness, with saying no when everyone else is silent. She once said, "I don't see myself as a hero. I only wish I'd had the chance to do more." That was her. Blunt, honest, restless, and yet her story has done more than she ever imagined. It has inspired countless women who thought they had to wait for permission to act. It has reminded countless men that strength doesn't always look like power. It can look like persistence. And it has stood, quietly but firmly, as proof that one person, just one, can change the tide of history without needing applause to do it. Because that was the thing about Nancy Wake. She didn't want a legacy. She wanted a result. And she got it. By the time Nancy Wake reached her 90s, the world had changed more than anyone could have imagined. The nations she had fought to protect were now allies with former enemies. The technology she once relied on, coded radios, forged documents, silk parachutes, had become museum pieces. And yet, she remained unchanged in one vital way. She never lost that steel. Even in her final years, Nancy Wake was sharp, funny, unshakably honest. Her body may have slowed, but her mind still moved like it always had. Decisive, unfiltered, fierce. She lived in London, in a modest home near the Thames, where the city hummed outside her windows, unaware that one of history's most effective saboteurs was drinking gin and watching the evening news just a few floors up. Her days were simple. A walk when she could, a drink every evening. No regrets, no nostalgia. She didn't like looking back. Not because she was haunted by her past, but because she'd already lived it once and didn't see the point in living it again. She received letters constantly, from historians, students, admirers, women who said her story had made them believe they were capable of more. And while she didn't often reply, she read every single one. The gratitude embarrassed her. She didn't see herself as extraordinary. She saw herself as someone who had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. Her friends dwindled with time. Most of the people who had fought beside her were gone. The voices that had once filled radios, whispered in resistance bunkers, shouted orders in the forest. They were now memories. But Nancy never tried to rewrite them. She didn't romanticize her comrades. She remembered them exactly as they were, flawed, frightened, and utterly brave. In 2004, at the age of 92, Nancy moved into the Royal Star in Garterhome, a residence for veterans in Richmond. She arrived with little fanfare and even less luggage, a couple of bags, some photos. Her medal still tucked away, rarely shown. The staff adored her instantly. She was cheeky, sharp-tongued, and always insisted on having her gin at 6 p.m. "I'm old," she'd say. "I've earned it." She'd hold court in the common room, telling stories it prompted, but only if the questions were good. She hated flattery. She hated fuss. She especially hated anyone treating her like an old woman who needed coddling. "I strangled a man with my bare hands," she once reminded a nurse who was trying to adjust her pillow. "I think I can manage." As her health began to decline, the world finally seemed to catch up. Documentaries aired. Schools added her story to the curriculum. Biographies sold across countries that had once ignored her. In 2010, the Australian government announced it would pay for her to be buried with full military honors. And still, she downplayed it. That same year, at 98, Nancy passed away quietly in her sleep. No drama, no headlines until the morning after. But once the news broke, tributes poured in from around the globe. World leaders issued statements. Veterans organizations flew flags at half-mast. The New York Times, the BBC, Le Monde, all ran obituaries that told the story of the White Mouse, the resistance legend, the woman who had fought her war in the shadows and come out on top. She was cremated in London. Her ashes were later scattered in France, near Montluçon, where she had led the Maquis into one of their fiercest battles. It was what she wanted. Not a tombstone, not a monument, just a return to the place where she had done her best work. And then came the moment she never would have asked for, but deeply deserved. In 2011, a statue was commissioned in her honor in New Zealand, her birthplace. France dedicated multiple streets to her name. Australia, at last, began to acknowledge her properly in military ceremonies. And in homes around the world, young girls began hearing her story, not as an afterthought, but as a centerpiece. Not because she was a woman in war, but because she was a warrior, full stop. Nancy Wake never liked being called a hero. She said real heroes were the ones who didn't come back. But her definition was too narrow, because courage isn't just about dying for something. Sometimes it's about living with what you survived and carrying it with strength and grace until the very end. And that's what she did. Without ever seeking a spotlight, she became one of history's most effective agents of disruption. And without ever asking for recognition, she received something far more lasting: respect. Legends don't always start with lightning. Sometimes they begin quietly, in a city square, in a nurse's uniform, in the sound of boots marching where they don't belong. Nancy Wake didn't set out to be remembered. She set out to resist. And in doing so, she became unforgettable. But if you strip away the myth, the medals, the mystery, what's left is something even more powerful: a person who stood up when most people stayed silent, a woman who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable, who decided that if she had a voice, she would use it. If she had strength, she would offer it. And if she had to walk in the mouth of danger, to do what was right, she wouldn't hesitate. That's the real story of Nancy Wake. Not just what she did, but why she did it. Because you don't lead sabotage missions across occupied France unless you believe deeply that freedom matters. You don't risk your life forging documents, hiding strangers, killing traitors, unless you believe that some things are worth more than safety. You don't live every day as a target, knowing that a single misstep could end everything, unless you know in your bones that there are lines you won't let the world cross without a fight. She once said, "Freedom is the only thing worth living for." While I was doing that work, I used to think it didn't matter if I died, because without freedom there was no point in living. That clarity, that simplicity, was her compass. And in a time when the world was unraveling, it gave her direction. It turned her into a weapon. And more importantly, it turned her into a leader, not one who sought followers, but one who inspired them by example. And that is why her story endures. Because every era has its darkness. Every generation faces a moment when the easy thing and the right thing aren't the same. And in those moments, the story of Nancy Wake becomes a map, a guide that says, if you want to make a difference, you don't wait for the right moment. You don't wait to be ready. You just begin. You act. You resist. You do what must be done. And yes, maybe you won't be remembered in statues. Maybe your name won't be taught in schools. But that was never the point. The point is to leave the world harder to control, harder to crush, harder to scare into silence. That's what Nancy Wake did. She showed us that ordinary people, when driven by conviction, can become extraordinary forces. That laughter can survive war. That dignity can survive torture. That one person can survive the full weight of history and still walk away whole, even if scarred. Her legacy isn't just in the medals gathering dust. It's in the resistance she ignited, the courage she awakened, and the quiet but stubborn hope that lives in every act of defiance that follows. So when we tell her story, we don't do it to worship her. We do it to remember what's possible. We do it to remind ourselves that there are people in this world who won't look away, who won't back down, who will step forward into danger because they believe that the fight, whatever form it takes, is worth it. Nancy Wake never needed us to call her a hero, but it matters that we remember why she became one. Because in remembering her, we remember what we are capable of and what we are responsible for. That's her gift to history. Not a tale of glory, but a blueprint for courage. And courage is always in season.